The Mysterious and Magical Zung, a stuffed wombat production.
This is the Shirehampton Stuffed Wombat Society with their performance of The Mysterious and Magical Zung. Our story starts on a beautiful sunny summer's day. A tall man walks briskly down a leafy suburban street. He pauses at the gate of one of the houses to take a handkerchief from his pocket. After dabbing away the beads of sweat that have formed on his brow, he opens the gate, strides purposefully up the garden path, and rings the doorbell.
Afternoon, Zung. I say, what a glorious afternoon.
Yes, so it is. Come on in, the kettle's just boiled. Can I tempt you to a cup of tea and a piece of lemon drizzle cake?
You most certainly can.
Come through to the kitchen so we can sit in the sunshine. Now, what's this surprise you had for me? You know, the one you mentioned on the phone.
Ah, yes. Well, remember we were watching Who Do You Think You Are on the telly a couple of months ago?
Yes?
It got me thinking about how much we actually know about our own ancestors.
I can't say I know that much about my parents, to be honest. Whenever I brought the subject of my father up with my mum, she'd just change the subject. Eventually I stopped asking, and I haven't really thought about it since.
But you'd like to know, wouldn't you?
Of course. Who doesn't want to discover where they came from? People love to know if they're related to royalty, or whether their ancestors had money, or if there was any scandal in their past. Why do you ask?
Well, I took the liberty of engaging a professional genealogist to see what they could find out about our respective families. All I had to do was give them our dates of birth and pay them their fee. When they've finished their research, they share whatever information they've turned up with the client via a video call.
Goodness, that sounds very efficient. Do I take it from that smug look on your face that the video conference has already been scheduled?
Am I really that easy to read?
Look, what time is this call supposed to start?
Any time now. If you can fire up your laptop, we can start it straight away.
Just a sec, the laptop's over there on the worktop. I'll just fetch it. Right. There. Can you do the technical stuff? You know what I'm like.
Sure. Okay. I'll start the video conference. Type in the genealogist's phone number and... Hello? Is that Jennifer?
Hello, Timothy. How nice to see you at last.
Thank you. Likewise. Can I introduce you to my friend Dick Zung? He's the other person for whom you've been doing the research.
Hi, Dick.
Hello.
So, Jennifer, do I take it from your email that you've managed to find out a little about our respective families?
Yes, I have indeed. Obviously, there is a limit to what I can achieve within your budget and from the information available in the archives and whatnot. But I think what I've found will be of interest to you both.
Brilliant.
By the way, you'll have to excuse any background noise. It's one of the pitfalls of working from home in a big city. Okay, whose ancestors should I start with?
Mugg's.
Rightio. Now, Timothy, your father is Charles Mugg and your mother is Miriam. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Let's start with your father. You probably know most of this, but I'll just mention it for completeness. So, he was born in 1938 in Reading and went to the local secondary school. He left school at 16 and went to work as a trainee bank clerk in Lloyd's Bank. He must have been fairly good at his job because he'd risen to the post of branch manager when he finally retired.
That sounds about right.
He was also quite keen on the horses too.
How do you know that?
Well, I found this article in the local paper. I'll send over the PDF in a second, but the headline says, "Local man wins big on Cheltenham meeting." The report goes on to say how Charles was a regular at the bookies, and this was his biggest win.
When was this, and does it say how much he won?
Let me see. This was 1968, and it was close to £400.
Crikey, I wonder what happened to the money.
Hang on. He's quoted as saying he plans to pay off some of the mortgage and to build an extension to house a snooker table.
Well, that never happened. I guess Mum was more concerned with having a car that didn't keep breaking down.
Which brings me nicely onto your mum, Miriam Mugg, née Floyd. She was born in Brighton in 1941. Before meeting your father, she trained in London as an actress. According to all accounts, she was very talented, but unfortunately your arrival put a stop to any dreams of an Oscar or a BAFTA. She did manage to fit in some radio work, but it was somewhat ad hoc. I found a short clip of her playing Lady Macbeth in a BBC production from the late 60s. Would you like to hear it?
Yes, please.
Give me a second and I'll play it for you.
The Thane of Fife had a wife. Where is she now? What will these hands ne'er be clean? No more of that, my lord, no more of that. You mar all with this starting.
Nice. She really was very talented.
Indeed, and she was quite the powerhouse in the local community. I found several pieces in the local newspapers about her exploits as president of the local branch of the Women's Institute. It sounds like her strawberry jam regularly won prizes at the local village fete too.
I remember your mum's jam from when I came round for tea. I never got it at home as my mum was allergic to strawberries.
Now, Timothy, you might be wondering where Charles got his interest in horse racing from.
It had crossed my mind.
Well, the likelihood is that it came from his father, your grandfather, George Mugg. Now, George was born into a working-class family in the East End of London in 1916. He didn't have much in the way of an education, but he was good with numbers and ended up as a bookie. So the young Charles would have been surrounded with copies of the Racing Post and other horse racing paraphernalia.
Ah, that makes sense.
Now, George was a small-time entrepreneur. I found evidence of this from an advert he placed in the newspaper for a board game he'd invented. Indications are that it was moderately successful at the time, though I'm not sure it would have appealed to the Xbox generation.
I suppose that might explain my passion for games too, then. How did this game work?
As you might guess, the game was based around horse racing. One player was the bookie and the rest were ordinary punters. The bookie created racetracks from a set of course pieces. A race could be chosen to be on the flat, over hurdles or jumps. There would be a field of 4 to 8 horses in each race, which would progress down the course, or not, depending on dice thrown by the bookie. The punters bet on the horses before the race, with each horse's odds being set by the bookie. The winner was the player who made the most profit. I think the bookie's profit must have been divided by the number of punters to give some sort of level playing field, to mix my metaphors.
I can imagine that might have been reasonable fun to play in its day. What was it called?
It's a mugs game.
Oh, I guess I should have seen that coming. Is that where the phrase comes from?
I didn't have time to follow that up, because I thought you'd like to know a little bit more about George's brother, your great-uncle Bartholomew Mugg, instead.
OK, that would be interesting. I saw him quite regularly when I was a child. I was too young to really know him well.
That's a shame, because he seems to be quite a character. He was born in 1920, just after the Great War. The first records I've unearthed for him are his academic achievements at Sheffield University, where he gained a first-class degree in mechanical engineering. From all accounts, he was a star pupil, winning several prizes during his degree. When he left university, he joined the Royal Engineers and played quite an active role in the Second World War.
What sort of thing did the Royal Engineers do?
One of their functions was bomb disposal. Your great-uncle was mentioned in dispatches for his work in that role. However, his efforts were not without controversy. One letter I came across at the Imperial War Museum was from his commanding officer to the army psychiatrist.
Oh dear, was poor old great-uncle Bartholomew ill?
Not according to the letter. Apparently, and I'm not sure whether you're going to believe this, your great-uncle had a passion for disarming bombs blindfolded. He said it sharpened his senses and improved his concentration. Of course, his superiors thought he was barking mad and might get himself killed. Nevertheless, his work was too important to have him taken off duty, so they were all extremely grateful and relieved when he decided to move on. His next role was working on the project to design the Mulberry Harbours used for the invasion of Normandy.
Crikey, I'm very glad he didn't get blown to smithereens.
Indeed, you'll be interested to learn that he also shared his brother's passion for inventing, only this time it was mechanical things rather than games.
I remember he was always making something in his shed when my dad took me round to visit.
From what I've just told you, it won't surprise you to learn that a lot of his inventions were quite dangerous. I found a couple of newspaper articles about them, which I'll share with you. The first is an accident report.
Oh. Man suffers multiple fractures in bizarre pogo stick accident. Is this my great-uncle?
Yes, he was testing a prototype motorised pogo stick. Subsequent investigations suggest he got his power to weight calculations wrong, with the result that he was catapulted over a hedge and into a field.
Poor Bartholomew. I suppose we ought to be grateful it wasn't a member of the public that got hurt.
Quite, but this last article will probably make your hair stand on end.
Why's that?
As you probably know, Frank Whittle created the first prototype jet engine in the late 1930s. Your great-uncle was clearly fascinated by its potential, because after the war he worked on the designs for a jet-powered go-kart. There were reports of him testing it on Pendine Sands in Wales. The policeman who stopped him estimated that the go-kart could well have been doing in excess of 300 miles per hour.
Crumbs. That is pretty scary.
Ah, no, that's not the scary bit.
What could be more scary than that?
He was planning to market them as a children's toy.
Seriously?
Fortunately, I think the police, and his brother George, managed to talk him out of it.
Well, that's a relief.
Later in life, Bartholomew became a bit of a recluse. There are a couple of extant letters from his brother, George, to Bartholomew asking where he'd been for the last couple of months. It's quite possible that Bartholomew moved abroad, because I can't find any records of his death.
Oh, that's a shame. It would have been nice to put some flowers on his grave.
That's all I found out about your family, Timothy. So shall we move on to your friend, Dick Zung?
Yes, thanks for that. Really fascinating.
So, Dick, are you ready to learn about your family's past?
Well, yes, I suppose so.
As you'll see, it's all very mysterious. One might even go as far as saying magical too.
Goodness. Well, what are you waiting for?
Let's start with your father, Tarquin, and your mother, Pearl. Now, I know from what Timothy has already told me that you were brought up by your mother and that you didn't know your father.
That's right. I don't know anything about my father other than his name. My mum used to clam up as soon as I mentioned the subject. All I know is that he was born in 1943 and they were married in 1961.
That's right. So here's a document I found from one Tarquin Zung. He was a patient at Faust Manor Psychiatric Hospital.
Well, wait, you don't mean that derelict building not far from here? You know, the one that people think is haunted?
Yes, that's the one, though I really doubt it's haunted. Anyway, Tarquin was a patient of the young Dr. Freddie Oust at Faust Manor. According to his patient records, he was suffering from the delusion that he was being pursued by a small round alien being.
Mugg?
Keep your mouth shut. Yes, let's hear what Jennifer has to say.
Oh, right, yes. So, did he get better?
The records show that he was discharged, but what happened after that is a bit of a mystery because he seems to have disappeared off the face of the earth. Your mother wrote to the hospital, but they assured her he wasn't there anymore. I tried everything I can think of, but he simply seems to have vanished. Perhaps he changed his name. It's very hard to be definitive, but that's the most likely option.
Poor old mum.
After he left, I gather your mum earned money as a seamstress. Life must have been pretty tough for you as a kid.
Yes, I learnt a lot from my dear old mum.
I don't know if you know, but your mum was also an only child too.
No, I didn't know that.
She was the daughter of Lisa Good and Jeremiah Howell. Jeremiah was an American GI who came over to Britain in 1942 to fight in the Second World War. It must have been quite a whirlwind romance, because their marriage certificate shows that they were married in December 1942. Soon after that, in September 1943, your mum, Pearl Howell, was born.
So that makes me a quarter American. I'm not sure how I feel about that.
Jeremiah's service records indicates that he joined up pretty soon after America joined the Second World War. Prior to that, he'd been a bean farmer in Boston, Massachusetts. Boston baked beans are quite a famous dish, you know.
Crikey! So that's where I get my love of beans from. He must have passed on his passion for them to my mum, and she in turn passed it on to me.
That sounds like a reasonable theory. So now you know a bit more about your mum and dad, let me take you back a generation.
What, you mean Julius Zung?
Yes, that's right.
This will be interesting. I know almost nothing about him. My mum said they emigrated to Australia in late 1961, just after Tarquin's marriage, and it wasn't long after that Tarquin lost contact with them.
Collectively, people who migrated from Britain to Australia in that period were called 10-pound Poms. I didn't have time to find out what happened to them, though.
What did you manage to find out about them, then?
Let's start with the marriage certificate. Here's a screenshot of it. Can you make out what it says?
It's for June 1942. Right, so Julius Zung, 20, profession travelling encyclopedia salesman, father Balthazar Zung, marries Brenda Hussey, 18, profession former circus performer.
That's right. I bet that's a bit of a surprise.
Well, the circus performer bit definitely is. What did she do in the circus?
This newspaper article and associated photograph might help. I'll just share it to your screen.
Hang on, which one are we looking at?
The one about the missing cat?
Oh, that one. Hang on. Brenda Hussey, a performer with Willie Clever's circus, made a tearful plea to Clapham Common residents to look out for her cat, Arkle. Miss Hussey said her act, Brenda Hussey and her talking pussy, simply couldn't go on without her beloved Arkle. Oh, and here's a photo of her cat. Crikey, Mugg, the cat. It looks awfully like your Sparkle.
Oh, so it does. It's just a coincidence, though. Look at the date on this article, August 1941.
Sorry, of course. Did she ever find her cat?
Sadly not. But fortunately for her, it must have been around this time that she met Julius, because as you've seen, they were married 9 months later.
Oh yes, so they did. I'm surprised Julius wasn't away fighting in the army, given that this is the middle of the war.
You'd have thought so, but I discovered that he was turned down by the army because he had flat feet. The RAF wouldn't have him because he was short-sighted, and the Navy decided he wasn't suitable because of severe seasickness. In this case, your grandfather spent his war trying to sell encyclopedias door to door.
That must have been an uphill struggle. I doubt encyclopedias would have been top of people's shopping list during the Blitz.
I expect you're right, which probably means he had quite a bit of spare time on his hands. During that time, I guess he might have read the encyclopedias, because he was a contestant on the BBC Home Service's Master Brain quiz show in 1946.
Do you know how he got on?
Well, we know he didn't win, but he did make it through to the final. Unfortunately, the BBC didn't save many recordings of programmes from that period, so I don't have a clip to play you. What I do know is that his specialist subject was the life and works of simian stylites, because it's mentioned in the Radio Times programme entry for that week.
I have a vague recollection that I've heard of Simeon Stylites. Isn't he the person who stood on the top of a pillar for a large portion of his life?
Good knowledge, indeed he was.
I'm not sure how he got that subject past the subject submission process. I mean, most of the answers are going to be along the lines of, he was standing on a pillar.
Nevertheless, he did. Sadly, the questions he was asked are lost to time. Still, being in the final is an achievement, isn't it?
Absolutely. I say, that's all been quite fascinating. Thank you, Mugg.
No, wait, there's more. You might want to strap in, because this is where things start to get weird.
What sort of weird?
Weird insofar as it gets rather mysterious. There's also the tiniest hint of the magical too, if you believe that sort of stuff.
Crumbs. I'm not related to Voldemort, am I?
No, nothing like that. Look, for starters, have you ever asked where your surname comes from?
No, not really. I mean, I guess everyone just accepts it without ever giving it a second thought.
True. So let's go back to Julius Zung, your grandfather. He was the son of one Balthazar Zung.
That's right. I remember my mum telling me that he'd died in 1962, just before I was born.
Okay, so far so good. I found Balthazar's death certificate, and it states that he was 72 when he died, which means he was born around 1890. The peculiar thing is that I couldn't find any record of his birth.
Would I be right in assuming that the records have probably been lost or destroyed?
Perhaps, but let me start by telling you a little story. Have a look at this picture.
Oh, that's quite an imposing building. It looks quite austere too. What is it?
That's the Swansea workhouse.
Right, so let me guess, you found a Balthazar Zung as one of the inmates.
No, not quite.
What do you mean by not quite?
Bear with me. I only reached the workhouse by working backwards through Balthazar's life, but it's probably easier to start here. It'll make the telling easier.
OK, go on then.
In the Swansea Workhouse Register of Inmates, I found one Di Lee. Now, it would appear that whoever was keeping the register was a bit sloppy with the entries, because instead of putting Di in the first name column and Lee in the surname column, they put them both in the first name column.
So?
The next column was for their circumstance, orphan, abandoned, etc. Dai Li was down as a pauper. Only the word pauper was written in the surname column instead of the circumstances column.
Poor little Dai Li.
Fortunately, he wasn't alone there, though. I found a girl, Harper Lee, born in 1885. Twin boys, Bruce and Spike Lee, were born in 1887, and twin girls, Vivian and Peggy Lee, born in 1889.
Well, at least he was with his family. What happened to his mother and father?
It's hard to tell. Again, the register isn't clear. See if you can make out what it says. Has the image come up on your screen yet?
Yes. Oh, does that say Gabriel? Galbriel?
Actually, as far as I can make it out, it says Galadriel.
Crumbs, you mean like in Lord of the Rings?
Exactly. I did say there was a bit of magic to this story. Obviously, not real magic. That'd be absurd. But a sort of magical connection.
So they're sort of one relatively happy family. In the workhouse, that is, though.
If by happy you mean eating gruel 3 times a day and having the Bible in Welsh drummed into you, then yes, they'd be happy.
Ah, so what happened to all these little Lees?
That's where it all starts to follow the familiar tale of so many of those who lived in the workhouse.
Don't tell me. They all died.
Pretty much. Harper, Bruce, Vivian and Peggy all died of severe cases of the plongal.
That rings a bell.
I think that's in pretty poor taste.
What?
Oh, right. So plongal is a disease of the brain, a build-up of calcium and iron on a sufferer's cerebrum, coupled with a shrinkage of the brain, causes slow and painful death. When people with this condition shake their head, a faint ringing can be heard as the iron and calcium-coated cerebrum makes contact with the inside surface of the skull.
Oh my word, that sounds horrible.
There's some suggestion that it's an inherited condition too, but I didn't have time to follow that up.
Goodness. So, what happened to Spike, Galadriel and Di, then?
Once again, the records are fairly sparse. I did find some information in the workhouse minutes that indicated that Spike might have had a discipline problem, but that's about it. There are no records of either him or Galadriel leaving the workhouse, and no death records either. Of course, that isn't unusual with people at the bottom of the social scale, but anyway, it's not important to this story.
Fair enough. What makes Dai Li so important, then?
I'm coming to that. But first, I'm sure you'll be relieved to learn that he gets adopted by one Mr. and Mrs. Clackham.
Hurrah for little Dai Li!
Now, I'm guessing that Mr. and Mrs. Clackham aren't the brightest people in Swansea, because when it comes to the 1901 census, they recorded him as being called Dai Li Paper. Perhaps being Welsh speakers, they misread pauper as paper. Who knows?
What's in a name? At least Di is out of the workhouse.
Quite so. And despite being quite a sickly child, he seems to prosper while under the care of the Clackhams. Piecing information I found together, it would appear that he gets a paper round at his local shop as soon as he's legally allowed. He makes quite a name for himself too, and soon becomes known as Dai Li, the newspaper. Sort of nominative determinism.
Oh, very funny.
It's quite a common thing in Wales, these sorts of nicknames. It was probably done in jest to start with, but Di clearly warmed to it.
So, what happened to him next?
After starting his life in the workhouse, he clearly wanted to grasp every opportunity to see the world. The next time I find him, he is on a ship to Germany in 1906.
What's wrong with England?
You clearly don't know many Welsh people. No, only kidding. Maybe he saw an advert, or perhaps he thought Germany simply sounded exotic, because that's where we find him next. But now he's obviously keen to fit in, so he's changed his name to Dai Li Zeitung.
You mean a straight translation of the word for newspaper?
Precisely. He even gets a job working for a paper in Berlin, because there are a couple of bylines under his name in the local newspaper.
So life is on the up for young Di, then?
Yes, it's all going swimmingly well for him until World War I breaks out.
Oh dear, I can't see this ending well.
Don't worry, he survives the war, but during the war he writes letters back to his friends in Swansea, and of course, they're all in Welsh. Now I guess you know what happened to Germans in Britain during the wars. Well, the same was true for British nationals in Germany, except in Di's case, it was a lot worse. One of his letters was intercepted, and naively, the Germans think it's some sort of coded message. They've clearly never seen Welsh written down before. Anyway, that led to his pretty swift arrest and subsequent interrogation.
I don't like the sound of that.
Let's just say that he probably had the sight kicked out of him. Fortunately, he must have convinced them that these were simply letters home, because he survives, but spends the rest of the war in an internment camp.
Why are you telling me all this?
I thought you might have guessed by now.
No.
Okay. After the war, Dye is still desperate to remain in Germany, but comes to the conclusion that his name doesn't sound Germanic enough, so he changes it to...
You're joking.
No, Dye Lee Zeitung changes his name to Balthasar Zung. Sadly for him, he still found life hard in post-war Germany, and in early 1921 he moves back to London, which is where we find him for the first time in the 1921 census.
So this Dai Lee is actually my great-grandfather.
Yes.
And he started in the workhouse?
Yeah.
Well, I'm blowed.
Amazing, isn't it? So that's where the surname Zung comes from. I think that pretty much covers everything. What do you think?
It's amazing. Mugg, did you know any of this?
No, it's news to me too.
Well, thank you both. That's all been quite marvellous, really wonderful. The Mysterious and Magical Zung was written by Tim Reed and starred Richard Hall as the announcer and Dick Zung. Tim Reed was Timothy Mugg, Jennifer was played by Ailish Fowler, and Miriam was played by Jill Barrington. Sound effects were unearthed in a local museum, and it was a stuffed wombat production.